My mouse working.
Welcome to our another edition of speaking about issues related to race and diversity and dealing with issues dealing with anti-racism. I'm Jamal Binden. And one of the things that we try to do is bring people in the know-how to help us address many of the contemporary issues, but well as historical issues, because they're all related to people of color. Today with me, I have Dr. Patrick Velasquez, who I've been knowing for a number of years, at least 30 years. And he used to be the director of the Chicano Awareness Center here in Omaha. And recently, he retired from University of San Diego, and been very much involved in helping students to go forward and become much more acclimated with the university, particularly post-secondary education. And many of these young people were first-generational people, so he worked in a number of programs like that. But also, he's been a contributor to our programs to help us discern some of the pressing issues of the day. And again, as we start to deal with these complexities that confront us in this racist community and society, Dr. Velasquez has been very helpful. So again, welcome to another edition of our show, Patrick.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
By the way, one of the things I want to start off is I guess we have a very trying times now with George Floyd, the death that happened recently, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the things that I really appreciate you, and also on in previous program, you had talked about the Omaha Police Department over 35 years ago, where you did some training, and it was based on racism and anti-racism. Here we are 35 years later, and we still got the problem. What I discern, not much has changed in the police department roles in contrast to African Americans and Chicano communities today. What are your observations about law enforcement, the legal system for African Americans and Chicano going forward?
I think you described it well in terms of the historical trajectory of this. It was over 30 years ago that I became involved with providing training, as we called it, cultural competence training to all 500 officers of the Omaha Police Department. I think this was in 1988. And it was quite an experience, man. I've made presentations about cultural competence in the Chicano community, Chicano culture, etc., to all kinds of audiences from preschool kids to social workers and school teachers, district administrators, etc. And the police department was clearly the most um, defensive, uninterested, unengaged, and even hostile audience that I've ever spoken to. And it wasn't fun at all speaking to these folks. I don't remember one female officer in the rooms at that time. I think we did 10 sessions of 50 officers each. And they all came in with their uniforms and their guns and their pepper spray and their tasers and their billy clubs. And so that was the audience that we had to speak to. And afterwards, I had to come to the conclusion that the training was totally useless. And so if you fast forward to where as an entire society where we're at right now with law enforcement, I think one of the things that I heard on National Public Radio says it very well, that across the country, police and other law enforcement units they tend to look at white folks as the people that they are to serve and protect. They tend to look at African Americans and Chicanos as the people that they need to control. And so that it's that strong and that clear of a dichotomy. And since I did that training with the cops over 30 years ago, I'm sure the Omaha Police Department, like virtually all police departments, even police departments on college campuses today, have become much more militarized. And they not only, have military equipment, which they don't hesitate to show off and utilize, but they think more like military folks. It's always been interesting to me that whenever you see a series of drug busts or immigration raids or something like that, the police always say, "Well, this is Operation whatever," like they're James Bond or some kind of secret agents instead of just a bunch of armed thugs. And I'm sure you've seen on television, as I have, all the Black Lives Matter rallies. I saw it at rallies for DACA, the Dreamers, the undocumented youth. But anytime there's a rally or a protest with people of color, here comes the police in full military uniforms with these metal shields and camouflage outfits, and they want to. It seems like they want to escalate the situation from the very beginning, and so yeah, I things have gotten a lot worse, and I guess if there's a positive side, it's the fact that the communities of color, even young people, as we saw in George Floyd's case, are now able to use their cell phones and capture these acts of raw racism on video for the entire world to see. So, um, I can only imagine. It's been a little while now since I visited Cuba. I've been to the island of Cuba many times, and they always share with me how incredulous they are about the degree of violence in the United States. And I can only imagine what they think when they see these scenes of like George Floyd being killed right in front of our eyes. So yeah, it's we've reached that point now where it seems like maybe people are raising the question. Have we? Is this going to make a difference? Is this going to be a turning point to where we can begin to have real serious reforms in law enforcement? I think most reasonable analytical observers would say no. And Ajmal, you and I are at the age where we have seen the political unfolding of the United States for a long time now, and we see what it's been like. Things go bad, and then we seem to, they throw a bone for us, and we seem to take a step forward, and then when nobody's looking, they make us take two steps backward, and that's the dialectic. That's the trajectory historically of the United States. So I don't think for a minute that the George Floyd verdict, although I'm pleased the guy was found guilty. I don't think that means for a minute that we've reached some critical point and things will be different unless people push for it, and then perhaps we can exploit that opening.
As you, Patrick, as you say that, two things come to mind. One is we have to have empirical data or evidence base to show that things are getting better. So when you
Mhm.
have a police department that's primarily composed of white folks, and particularly people who are Nazi sympathizers or white supremacists or members of the Klan inside there embedded. Again, we get announcements almost every day on the internet where they're discovering correspondence between police officers and people who are white supremacists and how they're donating money to them. What
Mhm.
happened January the 6th illustrates there are a lot more people embedded in the FBI. And the FBI is complacent and complicit in how African Americans and Latinos were treated in the 60s and the 50s. They were in bed. Some of the people who ended up being killed in the South were probably informed on by the FBI and law enforcement, the sheriffs. They see themselves as part of the racist community.
Mhm.
And I had a conversation today. I'm not going to mention the Uncle Tom's name or the Aunt Your Mama's name, but they were talking about aren't things getting better? Well, all you got to do is look at the geographics of our incomes of our respective groups. You look in terms of our populations. We still got segregated schools where we just don't control anything. And I had a Chicano say to me recently, well, don't you think the busing thing messes with our whole community? I can see it on one side. But again, if you live in an enclave or in a ghetto or the burials and those people control how the water come in utility, how do you want to wish down any person when they have a better way of life and we never see what they have? They get to drive the latest cars. And one example, when I went to Botswana and I came back, I noticed that a lot of white folks in our state and our community were driving more efficient cars. And it was the poor people of color had them long gas guzzlers because we couldn't afford it. Not to say that they went some nice cars like a deuce and a quarter, but again, we the last one to get to a lot of things because we can't afford it. So I really think at the end of the day, you can't promote Latinos or Chicanos or African Americans or whoever if they have no track record of fighting in the trenches. And so I refuse to let our standards down, particularly when we know what our people need. And when you look at the prison population, you look at the judges, you look at the whole court system, and they act like they don't know what's going on. So the George Floyd thing, as Angela Davis said years ago when their trial was over, they said, well, do you think justice has been had? She said, justice has been never been on trial in the first place. So my
Mhm.
point back to this whole George Floyd, that whole trial should have taken maybe 30 minutes, if that. And when they murdered Emmett Till back in 1955, there was no trial there. The two people who killed him, they went scot-free, they got away. And you think the government would have intervened and got them for something, but no, they let those guys die a natural death. So that's the history we have to deal with trauma as brown and black people. And you look at people who are struggling to get here and we're making them drown in the water with their kids. And you got the audacity to talk to me about stupid, foolish stuff. Are you crazy? Have you lost your mind as a community? So at the end of the day, we have learned nothing from our great leaders if we're not challenging those police officers. Think about, there have been more people killed unarmed, and this is a rare example of a police officer going to jail. And, not, and most likely, they might give him a summer camp or give him an exoneration when the time comes. You never know.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that have really struck me and that have happened just within the last week. One was something I think that occurred very late in March, almost at the end of March, that didn't really come to light in the national media till about the last week or so. And that was the police murder of a young Chicano in Chicago named Adam Toledo. And I'm sure you probably saw the video, right, of him. Apparently, he had a gun, but he threw the gun when he was told to, and he put his hands up in the air, showed the cops he had nothing at all in his hands, and they immediately shot and killed him.
Wow.
The cop shot and killed him. I believe he was 13 years old.
Right.
And so, there's a very big Chicano community in Chicago. There's a very big Puerto Rican community in Chicago, and they have a long history there. What really blows me away about this is that in so many of the national media accounts of this incident, in which they show the video and so forth, they simply say, well, a young 13-year-old boy was shot and killed. They don't want to mention the fact that he's a Latino. Um, I understand it, although it really pisses me off, but I'm sure that the mentality of the media is that we don't want to start acknowledging this kind of racism against Latinos. We know it exists, but we don't want to go there as media because then we're going to be spending a lot of our time on that, like we're already spending time covering the police murders of black people. We don't want to spend our time on that. We'd rather cover the funeral of the prince in Great Britain or Megan and whatever his name's problems are. Their
Prince
interview.
Harry, I think.
Yeah, they'd rather spend their media attention on that garbage. And so it really bothers me. I've seen this in several news sources where they talk about this young 13-year-old boy gunned down by police, but they won't mention the fact that he's a Latino and this is part of a pattern. Also, I found it very ironic that yesterday, the same day of the verdict of Chauvin, the cop who murdered George Floyd, that
In cold blood for
in
8
cold
minutes to
blood,
9 minutes.
yes. And in the San Diego newspaper, there was an article saying that they just made public that here in San Diego, in 2019, October 2019, there was a young man, an adult, not a adolescent, but an adult. His name was Angel Zapata Hernandez. And if you want to check this out, you can probably Google Angel Hernandez killing in San Diego. He was killed remarkably similarly to the way that George Floyd was killed. He was simply hanging around the trolley tracks in near downtown San Diego. There's a trolley system here, the public transportation. And of course, the trolley system has to have its own cops. And so this young man who had a series of mental health challenges was seen by one of the trolley cops just walking around the trolley tracks, sort of meandering around, but they felt like he looked suspicious. And he and then a private security guard that the trolley system contracts with, they chased him down, they handcuffed him. He ran away from them with his handcuffs on behind his back. They ran him down, they threw him on the ground. One of these rent-a-cops had his knee on the guy's back while his face is on the cement. And I mean, what would you do in a situation like that? Of course, you're going to struggle and try to get away. And they kept telling him, "Stop struggling, stop struggling," but he wouldn't stop. And so the trolley cop put his knee on the back of the guy's neck. I mean,
Wow.
it looks almost I watched the 37-minute video yesterday that was finally, after almost 2 years, finally released to the public. And it shows 3 different angles, some of the stationary cameras that they put up by the trolley stops, and then the body camera of the trolley cop. and it's just incredible and horrifying to watch. And the city, I should say, the trolley company itself settled with the young man's family for around $5 million. So it's about $5 million in tax money that paid for this family. And if you watch it again, it's just horrifying. They call the police, the actual San Diego police, who come out, and these two cops that took him down and killed him then are acting like, well, are you okay, buddy? Are you okay? And the guy's laying there motionless. Well, he's dead. And that guy had his knee on the guy's neck for about over 6 minutes.
Wow.
And they took him, he was dead, man. They checked his pulse, he had no pulse. And so they took his body away. And the district attorney of San Diego refused to file charges against those trolley cops. She said that given the evidence that she looked at and the context and so forth, she didn't think that they could convict those cops beyond probable cause. So they walked away, man. They killed that guy on camera, a young Chicano, and he was unarmed and he had not stolen anything. He had not assaulted anybody. He was simply walking around the trolley tracks, looking a little disoriented. That's the kind of situation that cops should never be the first ones to intervene in a situation like that, because it's like somebody said about the George Floyd case, man, that if you're doing something and the cops come with all this armor and all their guns and stun guns and billy clubs and tasers, spray, pepper spray, and everything, their very presence escalates the situation. And you might have a young kid like this guy who was okay until they came up on him, and then he got scared and he ran away. And again, the cops, they have this mentality where if it's like they demand automatic, immediate compliance. And if you don't do exactly what you tell them, they're ready to take your life. And so this is, I'm still shaking my head in disbelief that this happened. And these cops walked away scot free. And it's the taxpayers that are going to pay the family of the young man. I'm glad that they won the settlement, because that's the least that they deserve. But
Right.
it's just again a very powerful statement about how little progress that we've actually made in law enforcement.
Well,
And
that,
as an educator, Jamal, you and I, as educators, we talk a lot about reform, the idea of reform in education. And I think we've always felt like we don't need reform, we need transformation. So it's interesting now that the same word reform is being applied to law enforcement. But once again, we can see that reform, again, training, over 30 years ago, I learned training does no good whatsoever. Um, I mean, we need a complete rethinking and transformation of law enforcement practices, at least in communities of color.
well, Patrick, one of the things, two things. One is what you described reminds me of Zachary Bear Hills, a Native American guy who has some mental health issues, and his mom called the police department, and they next thing you know, he's dead. And then, of
Mm,
course, the police chief and them, the cohorts, they fire the guys, then they get their jobs back. And
mm,
one of the things we did was we held a community forum with many Native American people in the community, and they were shocked why the county attorney did not bring any charges in that case. I also found out that they did pay some kind of settlement in the case, but again, what is the value of a person's life? And again, this is what happens when these guys get away with it. Some of them should be fired on the spot, but that doesn't happen. Even in the case of Fred Hampton, the FBI and the law enforcement in Chicago back in when he was killed, he was a young guy under right around 25 or so. They paid his estate millions of dollars, or at
mm,
least a million. We didn't hear about that until 20 years later because they
mm.
probably had one of those clauses or secretive clause when they fire these handkerchief head Negroes and Till Talk Uncle Toms from their jobs, and they mistreat them or disrespect them because of their ethnicity or their race. They go away and put their heads between their legs and cry and just keep stuff to themselves when they know they're catching hell because of that. I'm going to switch up and ask you a kind of different question. We've been talking about racism and police officers and so on. And you alluded to, Patrick, just a minute ago about education, how we've evolved in training. And again, I think some people are incapable of learning. And I some think some people are too dumb to be a racist. Again, that's a cold-blooded way of putting it. But the question is, one of the challenges we face in Nebraska and Omaha is appropriation of racist white teachers teaching so-called diversity studies at post-secondary institutions about African Americans and Chicanos and so on, and they have no significant contacts with our community or our people, or even the oppressed people, and they never speak out. Quiet as a church mouse. In actual fact, their behavior reminds you of a mouse, or as some would say, a rat.
Mhm.
But the state of California recently enacted a mandatory, at least I thought it was a mandatory diversity program for people of color. And I found out later on it isn't mandatory. But can you talk to me a little bit about it? How did they set up something in California and in Nebraska? We can't get our lazy, incompetent Department of Education to set up anything. So how did that happen in California? Give me a little bit of background, because I think you might give us a blueprint how to avoid the snafus and the negativities that you guys experience in California.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. And the context, of course, is that Latinos make up about 40% of the California population, and Asian Americans make up about another 15 or 16%, and African Americans make up about 6%. Native Americans probably make up about 1%. So you can do the math, man. White people are in the minority here in California,
California.
less than 50% of the population. And so some progressive folks, certainly a lot of progressive people of color realize that if you're going to be a professional in the state of California, you've got to have competence, you've got to have knowledge of the different ethnic groups that make up the majority of the state. And so they've realized that school curriculums that have been historically monocultural need to change, and we need to have ethnic studies, Chicano studies, Black studies. It does raise a really critical question that you're alluding to about who teaches these courses. And we've seen, I have seen in California, one of the instances or examples that comes to mind is that the institution that where I worked for 28 years, University of California at San Diego, they had an education studies department that was founded and run by a white professor who built a career on the backs of people of color. He's all his research was on students of color. And some people thought he was some kind of white hero, like a great white father figure. But this guy, you talk about quiet church mice, he never said a word, man. He never made a peep about all the racism on his own campus. He would talk about equity in the K through 12 system, while the University of California, San Diego was blatantly excluding Black and Chicano and Native American students with racist admissions policies, and then having underfunded retention programs that allowed those students to fail. So again, the problem, one of the problems we see in California schools, K through 12, is that the great majority of teachers are still white. And the numbers that I mentioned are even more in favor of people of color if you look at school age children. So, I think in California, the number of white students in public schools, obviously a lot of them have their kids in private schools, but the percentage of white students in California public schools probably around 20% now.
Oh, wow, that's real low.
Yeah, possibly less. And so, but again, they still dominate the ranks of school teachers in California. And so you've got people trying to teach some of these courses or even a certain unit maybe within a course, and the folks have no cultural competence whatsoever, may in fact be downright hostile to people of color. You might have, I mean, there's a lot of people in California that voted for Donald Trump. I don't doubt that some of them are teaching in our schools.
Right.
And so, so that's been a real problem. Some of the things that have happened recently, I can mention a couple of struggles that have gone on. We have three layers of higher education in California, public higher education. We have the University of California, which weirdly has some strange degree of constitutional autonomy. And so the legislature can do very little to mandate curriculum or staffing or things like that within this highest level of the University of California. Then they have the California state universities and then the California community colleges. In the CSUs, they recently had a requirement imposed upon them by the state legislature of California through a legislative bill by an assemblywoman who's formerly a black professor at San Diego State University named Shirley Weber. And Dr. Weber was in the assembly. She drafted this bill. She engineered it, pushed it through the state legislature, which was not easy. And then it was signed by our governor. And so now every student that graduates from one of these California state universities must take at least one course in ethnic studies. And I heard Dr. Weber talk about this publicly, and she talked about how, as they were proposing this, all of a sudden people come out of the woodwork from the Jewish community, the Armenian community, and say, "Hey, we want to be represented in this curriculum." And she said, "Where have you been, man? Like for the last 30, 40 years while we're fighting the battle for diverse curriculum and ethnic studies." And so they didn't do that, man. They in the legislation they carefully defined that these courses have to reflect African American, Chicano Latino, Native American, or Asian American communities. And so that I feel is a win. You know, that's a good thing. And locally, one of the institutions, San Diego State, had actually already agreed to do that before the legislative bill. But I think this just gives them more
Right.
impetus. But the other thing that happened was that there was another bill in the state legislature of California to make ethnic studies mandatory in California high schools. And it passed through the legislature. And then it went to Governor Newsom for his signature, and he vetoed it. He would not sign it.
Why would he veto that?
Well, the what we hear, the information that I've heard, and I think it's pretty reliable because it's been very visible, is again the powerful Jewish community in California has come out publicly against ethnic studies. And even though they have strong representation of the Jewish experience in religious studies, which is where it belongs, they also wanted to be a dominant force in ethnic studies in high schools. And then there were some other groups, including Armenians and some Arab groups as well. And of course, a lot of racist white folks that didn't want anything to do with ethnic studies. And so they all collaborated to pressure the governor. And so he vetoed the legislation.
Wow.
Subsequent to that, the State Department of Education, which has really not much power, they put together some curriculum, some lessons or units, supposedly with diversity. The scholars that drafted that original curriculum on ethnic studies refused to work with this, and they said that the final product from the Department of Education was worthless. It was watered down and worthless. But the Department of Education has made that available to all school districts, but they don't have to touch it if they don't want to. It's not required. But this again was their way of throwing a bone to communities of color and saying, well, look at what we're doing for you. We're giving you diverse curriculum. Schools can do it. But it's not going to be anything close even to the relatively minor reform that there would have been through mandatory ethnic studies. Think about it again, even with the California state universities, that you can graduate from one of these CSU campuses having taken one course in one of these ethnic studies areas. So you could take a course in Chicano studies and know absolutely nothing about the other three communities of color. And but they act like we're supposed to pretend, you know, that that's changed the world for us to some degree. And so we have a long ways to go, but that's what the battle has been. And again, it's very interesting to see that even in a state like California, with so many people of color, actually more than 50% of the state is people of color, that even then we cannot have any degree of control over the very education that our students receive. So we again, progress, I'm not so sure if we have any, it's very minuscule.
You know, Patrick, one of the things that I wrestle with, particularly as I'm getting older, is how do you develop, and for me, is how do you develop a matrix if you're effective as a leader, as a politician, or whatever? And sad to say, I've come to see a different rubric where I'm thinking many people we thought it was all this good and great haven't delivered, or they're not effective because even though we have district elections in Omaha, we get these people in the office and they don't interact with their communities or their people. And I will tell folks up front, I'm probably the only African American who voted for term limits. Not that I dislike Ernie, but I believe in continuity and change. And I also believe in bringing other people to the table because I tell people when you operate in villages, communities, and rural areas, and you dealing with people where they collectively come together, it's not about the code of the personality. So my question specifically is, as a person who's been effective in your institutions or effective in Omaha, or whatever, how do we or should we measure ourselves as leaders for our respective groups or our total groups, particularly if we're rushing or advocating race advancement of our people who've been historically oppressed?
Mhm. It's a little bit like writing a proposal for funding for a certain program, an idea that you have. And when you write a proposal, you have to describe your objectives, first of all, what you're trying to achieve. And those objectives have to be measurable. You have to have some way of determining whether you met those objectives or not. And that's part of the proposals. You have to say, this is the way I'm going to assess the effectiveness of this program. And again, we talk in higher education about this all the time. How do you assess the effectiveness of programs or curriculum? What I have seen in higher education in California is that so-called diversity initiatives, programs and services designed specifically to support students of color, have the most strict scrutiny in terms of determining whether they're effective or not. You have academic departments that are almost all taught by white professors, especially in fields like chemistry and math, where there is no assessment of learning whatsoever. Their assumption is, well, we teach the courses and so the students learn, and we look at their grades. That's one form of assessment. And that's crap, man, because no assessment person in higher education would suggest using grades as a degree of measuring learning. So I think if we talk about individuals or we talk about organizations that supposedly are designed to increase anti-racism and tear down the racial hierarchy, it's the same sort of thing, man. It's you've got to have objectives first of all. What exactly are you trying to accomplish? If you don't have that, how are we supposed to measure whether you're effective or not, or whether you're just talking all the time?
You know,
Uh,
it hit me as a no disrespect to the NAACP, but then there is disrespect. One time I asked one of the leaders, how many letters did you write to Lincoln? Or how many public policies issues did you address? How many people did you help? And the response was none. I'm
mhm,
like, you got to be kidding. It's a chain organization. In other words, if an organization is supposed to be addressing race issues or they're supposed to be addressing economic issues or whatever, at some point you have to have a barometer. And one
mhm,
example I'll use is right now they have some program where they're saying that these African American kids are getting all these A's and B's, over 400. But you go to the university and you look at graduation rates, something is wrong there. Or you have teachers who tell you that there are students who they let pass just to get them out of the classroom. They're doing their service to those kids. Now, again, I don't disagree with some of the Europe-centric brainwashing education they ramrod down their throat about those dead racist presidents and stuff. But something is wrong when the kid gets through with 12 years of schooling and they can't read and write, and or else they can't do basic things. And another example I use, and I don't want to be flippish, but I know people go to church every Sunday and go to mass and this and that, and some of the biggest criminals you can imagine. Trump is a religious man. He invokes the Bible, but the way that he treats people, and I'm not just talking about Trump as an individual, I'm talking about the Trumpites.
mhm.
You got that congressman down in Florida who's been, they say, alleged sex trafficking and stuff like that. How does that happen? Is somebody going to ever tell on you? So part of what my concern is, we have to begin to establish our own rules. And at the end of the day, it isn't whether you got $1 million salary or you got Michael Jordan who's making billions of dollars or whatever. You talking about him? It's about us collectively as a people. And right now, we're talking about the migration of Latinos, Chicanos, people from Central and South America coming to the borders. And why are they coming to the borders? Because we haven't dealt with the existence and creation of what pull that made that push pull migration. And then when they get here, then we treat people disrespectfully and do the things that we do. So I'm really concerned about how we are as a people, as they say, La Raza, are sitting on our hands doing nothing.
Yeah, there's a couple of examples, or one example I see in California, and I'll give you both sides of the coin. I'm a member of an organization here in San Diego. It's called the San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio on higher education. So we're like a council on higher education. We're a very loose knit organization that monitors all of the local post secondary institutions in San Diego to see how well they're supporting Chicano students. And this year we put together a document that has our priorities and our strategies on it, and the kinds of changes that we want to see take effect in our local institutions. So at the end of the year, maybe 2 years down the road, we will be able to look and see to what degree we have been successful as an organization because we've got objectives that we can measure at the end. So we're recommending things like every college campus should have a department of Chicano studies or ethnic studies. I mean, a full department, not just a program. That there should be the hiring of Chicano faculty across disciplines. That there should be at least one person on every campus that has the necessary responsibility and authority to ensure the success of Chicano students. So we've got a number of things like that. We want changes in law enforcement on our college campuses. One of the groups that we approached to try to enlist their support is a group called the California Latino Legislative Caucus. And as the name indicates, this is a coalition of Latinos that have been elected to the state assembly and the state senate in California. There's at least a dozen of them. And so I sent an email to their contact person that I drew from their website with our priorities and strategies so that they can support them. And obviously, as members of the state legislature, they help to determine the amount of funding that all these institutions get. So they're in a very unique place to put accountability on those institutions, make sure they're doing what they should. And this person from the caucus wrote me back and said, I'm sorry, but we don't disseminate any information to the caucus unless it's part of their own projects. And
Wow.
so we can't even give them your recommendations. Um, if you go and look at the website for the California Latino Legislative Caucus, you will see some quote unquote policy issues, but there are no measurable objectives for that organization. As
Wow.
far as I'm concerned, they are absolutely useless. They do nothing to help our communities.
Right.
And so again, the question, well, how do we determine if these people are for real, if they're change agents or advocates or not? Man, if they have public pronouncements of what they do and there are no measurable objectives, then they're not serious.
Right.
How are you going to come and say, how are you going to come forward and say that you're an effective organization if you don't even have any objectives that can be measured?
You
So
know,
it's a very sad case. Again, people trying to get into these positions for money, for power, for status, but they're not making themselves accountable to our communities.
um, one of the things that I'm always wrestling with is, in terms of in our community, there's this conflict between sexual orientation and race and class and so on. And I've been around enough white liberals where they would say racism is less and is dissipating and that our issue is class. And then I hear some people say, we have to give people of different sexual orientation the same accolades or less credibility as we as African Americans or Hispanics or Latinos or Asians or Native Americans, even though we've been dealing with this stuff for generations, as a Malcolm would say, 450 years of sun up to sundown, working for free for this racist country. And one of the things that I'm concerned with is the conflict, but also how the gay community or homosexuals or LGBTQ plus, which is appropriate term they say, uh, have dominated the scenes of so-called diversity, and these words so-called diversity. And my question is, what is your perspective of that group and their advocacy for acknowledgement of our struggle or even their struggle? How do you weigh in on that discussion? Or can we weigh in on that discussions as people of color without having our livelihood threatened or challenged just for raising some questions of conversation?
No, I think it's an important question. There's a couple of ways that I would look at it. One is in my own personal philosophy. I will not actively join or support or march with any organization or institution the 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 majority of which is white. And so if you ask me, am I a supporter of feminism? Am I a supporter of LGBTQ rights? Philosophically, yes, I do support all their rights, but I will not march with those groups or align myself actively with them if the majority of their communities are white. And that's the case here. Now, if we talk even about the overlap between communities of color and the LGBTQ community, that's another interesting dimension. One of the best ways that I've seen in thinking about this was actually written about by one of my graduate school mentors, a very progressive white woman named Daryl Smith, who is professor emeritus at the Claremont Graduate University. And in her book, which is called Diversity Works, she talks about a principle called differentiation and inclusion. So that when we talk about diversity in higher education, for example, we can include all these groups as part of diversity, right? Not only communities of color, but the LGBTQ community, white women, they're all part of this inclusive group that represents diversity, but they have to be differentiated, right? Our experiences are not all the same. The experience of the LGBTQ community, which again, majority white, is very different than the historical experience or the contemporary experience of African Americans or Chicanos and Latinos. So, we can't always keep that, treat these groups as they're all the same. They have the same type of needs or even the same degree of needs. And again, I see this often in the field of education where, just as I mentioned about the Jewish community, where sometimes people from the LGBTQ community come in and say, well, we want to be a dominant force in ethnic studies. You should have a whole series of courses on our experiences within Black studies or Chicano studies, whatever the case may be. And again, my feeling is there's already a academic field called gender studies, critical gender studies. And there are thorough treatments of the LGBTQ experience in that field. So to want to come and take over ethnic studies doesn't seem appropriate to me. I have no problem whatsoever if there's a course, for example, in Chicano studies that deals with the experiences of Chicanas, with Mexican women, or a course that deals with the LGBTQ folks in the Chicano community. But that is not the academic core of Chicano studies. That's not the academic core of Black studies, I don't believe. Again, they have a place, a very prominent place in critical gender studies. And the academic core of ethnic studies is something very different.
Patrick, as you allude to that, one of the things that I noticed, and it didn't hit me until I've been following locally as well as national Anti-Defamation League. And they actually brought an expert here a couple of years ago, and he did I thought, a pretty good presentation on extremism. And he was talking about white extremism, but race was also embedded in his presentation, but it was a secondary type of conversation because they were, again, focusing on Jewish agendas and people who are anti-Semitic.
Mhm.
And when I went to the website, actually, in fact, I reached out to the guy because I thought he did a good job. Didn't hear a word from him afterwards. It was like, we ain't got nothing to do with African Americans. We don't want to talk to you. Leave us alone. So I'm like, okay, I can understand that. And I
Mhm.
talked to one of my Jewish friends, and they says, no, Jamal, that's for a slippery slope, and they have a
Mhm.
lot of economic and political and social power. They can cause you to lose your job if you question. Like, you got to be kidding. So I go to
Mhm.
their website, and I noticed that all of their senior staff and staff members, ADL in New York and so on, there was not one person of color. I'm like, how does that work? And you talk about racism and historical hatred and all these kind of things that we've endured from law enforcement for years, quiet as a church mouse. And then lately, I've been following how some of them are very angry about African American or Black Lives Matter because they support the rights of the Palestinians. Again, it's logical, just like supporting people who in South Africa who experienced apartheid. Then I go and I look again to their board of directors, and I didn't see anybody of color. So I went on the website and I sent a little note to the person. I haven't heard from them. But on one of these other Facebook pages, I made a comment about it. And the person, well, you didn't see well. There is one Black woman. And I looked and saw this Black woman. She was a corporate sellout Uncle Tom type. I don't know the person, and so I shouldn't be calling her Uncle Tom. But at the end of the day, I know the experience of being the only Black person or African American in the room, and you got 15 other white folks who have the meetings before and after, and they outvote you every time and even vote you off. One example I like to say is I got kicked off the ACO board in Nebraska for missing 3 meetings. And you and I both know there have been thousands of people in these organizations that missed 3 meetings and they never got kicked off. Well, part of my agenda is that I'm not taking no suck up pills, but part of the question, Patrick, for me is how do we let other people appropriate our struggle and our issues, and we're not about our own respective groups, and no wonder we're not surviving. They're pimping us and they're doing what they're doing. Now, the last point, I met a woman, African American woman, who's from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and she talked about that cesspool before it became national. They pimp the race issue. They make all this money. Their board of directors are predominantly white, and they have no structure, even internally and externally, to clean their own cesspool house up. So when I see these organizations, they have some good literature here and there, but they're suspect. And then some of us, like you and I are having this conversation, I wouldn't be surprised after this is aired, somebody's gonna call us anti-Semitic or call us racist or whatever. Hold on, we the one invented the term. You can't take our stick and beat us with it when we know what we're talking about. We get our experience through osmosis just by being born, as Malcolm says, in American democracy or so-called American nightmare. But my question is, how do we push back so these people are not making thousands of dollars in our communities off our people's back? In the meanwhile, we're still homeless. We still don't have enough food. COVID-19 is a classic example. We got some of the lowest immunization rates because they didn't want to come to our community. And then when they establish a clinic in our community, majority of people who come into the community are not people who look like you and me.
Mhm. Yeah, and when they do the clinics in communities of color, they always make sure that we get the Johnson and Johnson vaccine. I mean, seriously, I have seen this in San Diego where they set up these community or these clinics, communities of color, and wow, guess what? You get the Johnson and Johnson vaccine that leads to blood clots and has like 66% efficiency compared to the Pfizer out in the suburbs with 90+% efficiency. So, yeah, in terms of how do we deal with it, I think we just have to call it out. And it's not always easy. I've again seen that many times in San Diego where I could give you a couple of examples of white folks that have a very colonial effort in communities of color. They set up a charter school or they set up after school programs. And on the surface, it seems like they're doing very positive work with Chicano youth and African American youth. But always what they're providing is a white person's vision of what Blacks and Chicanos need to be successful. That does not include a critical consciousness or a commitment to being a change agent for your own community. And so I've gotten in arguments with some of my own people here in San Diego where I've called out those folks and said, hey, that's a colonial project. It may seem like they're doing good things for our kids, but that's a colonial project. And ultimately, it's counterproductive. So sometimes I've approached institutions, say, what are you doing? They'll say, well, we work with such and such a program and they're really good. And I'll tell them, I said, no, they're not really good. That's a colonial project. That's you all's vision of what my community needs. But we're the ones that should be defining that kind of
Right.
need and success. So I think we just have to be very frank and honest and not worry about hurting people's feelings. That, as Pablo Freire said, when people like that, when members of the colonizing group come into our communities, they never can bring solutions with them. The strength that's necessary to empower colonized communities can never come from the colonizer. Even if on the surface it seems like they're doing benevolent things, in the long run, what they're doing is counterproductive. And so we have to call it out and try to put a stop to it.
You know, one of the things that come to mind, and you and I have talked a little bit about this in the past, and I know that you've not been a great fan of President Obama, even though he's been in office for 8 years, and we have little to show as African Americans and Latinos or Chicanos. And I know Cornel West and them was very critical of them, and people were very mad at them for being critical of the first Black president. But at the end of the day, you got Wall Street who got a bailout. You got a person who had some of the highest rejection rate of people who are trying to immigrate who are fleeing prosecutions from some of those countries and so on. And even the military, you know, they got some increases that they didn't deserve. I found out from someone we have over 800 military bases across the world, and China has 3. No wonder they're kicking our butts. But my point is, going back to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, people are trying to give them a little bit of a yardstick to say, hey, give them a chance. And I know that you're concerned and I'm concerned about the military spending, particularly in other people's country. You know, the Filipinos chase the United States out. They're getting ready to leave Afghanistan. because they couldn't achieve what they wanted. You know, they're going to bring democracy to somebody else, but they can't bring it to Black and brown folks and Native Americans and Asians in this country. By the way, we didn't say anything about the killings of Asian people recently, and that's a big topic also. But how do we deal with public advancement and investment? And again, it's almost contrary to what we're doing in the military, because the military is not saving nobody's butt. I mean, it's kind of unfortunate, but they get roughly 15% of all the spending.
Mhm.
And again, you can imagine what the infrastructure look like, whether we want to talk about reparations, whether we talk about historical rights and wrongs, you name it. How do we be able to challenge this military establishment or law enforcement or whatever when they're just sucking us dry and we have nothing to show? We walk around here, basically, many of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, and some don't even have that, and yet we're still pumping money for these troops to go and harass other people in their own country. You have no business in other people's country unless they invite you in. And at some point, get your butt out, because at some point, the Vietnamese, look at that. And I hate to talk about Vietnam because people think that you're being mean spirit when you say you went there to liberate them, and look, they're both a united country. They're both North and South Vietnam. I mean, how does that work? Afghanistan is another example. How do we have that discussion without somebody thinking that we are from another planet just having this conversation?
Yeah, it's another difficult discussion. Now I'm talking about even within our own communities of color. It's a difficult discussion. Oftentimes we get, justifiably so, we get preoccupied with the day-to-day issues of struggles for survival, especially with COVID now. But even before the pandemic, talking about the issues that concern us on an everyday basis, like law enforcement, police brutality, the miseducation of our students, and so forth. And so, an issue like military overspending is, I think, almost abstract to a lot of people in our communities, but it has a direct effect in our communities in many ways. And as you're talking about, one of the reasons why higher education is so underfunded is because we spend 50% of discretionary spending on our military as a country. So, we have historically Black colleges and universities that get minuscule amounts of federal funding, federal support. They have now this concept of Hispanic serving institutions and Title V, that also provides federal grants to support Latino students in higher education. Minuscule amounts of funding provided to those programs because the money is going to the military. And just as we as people of color are socialized and brainwashed to see the cops as protectors of our community, when in fact they're not. They're there to reinforce and perpetuate the racial hierarchy. It's the same with the military. We get brainwashed and socialized to believe that the military is protecting us, when in fact they are escalating hostilities all over the world. The only thing our military protects are the corporations that want to do business in foreign countries. And the military tries to provide a quote unquote, I think as Henry Kissinger used to say, a stable environment for American investment. And when we say American investment, not talking about people of color. So it's helping the wealthy become wealthier. Just as a quick example, it's a mind blowing thing to see that you have private corporations like Blackwater that are making a fortune. And what do? They provide security for our military overseas in countries like Iraq. Now, what the hell's wrong with our military if they have to go contract with somebody else to protect themselves? How are they going to protect us when they have to contract with a private company for their own protection? So, man, there's white people making money and money upon money on top of money all over this country through the military. And if I learned one thing about white society years ago, it's if you want to understand anything in this country, follow the money. Look at who's getting wealthy from this. And the military is a great example of that. So we really have to lean on our elected officials to start reducing the size of the military, just as we're leaning on local officials to reduce the size of law enforcement agencies. It's the same principle. In my district in California, in San Diego, We have a young white woman named Sarah Jacobs, a Democrat who was just elected to the United States Congress. Her grandfather was a professor at UC San Diego, one of the most racist institutions in the United States. And she's posing as a pseudo liberal. And we need to hold her feet to the fire. All the folks like that that are serving in the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and we've got to start leaning on them. Biden's talking about needing all this money for infrastructure. Man, if you took most of the money away from the military, I'm pretty sure we could survive with only 500 military bases instead of 800 outside the United States. Outside the United States. So again, it's a matter of political strategy and in organization. And as we saw with the George Floyd verdict, it takes constant pressure to get anything done.
Patrick, we're getting kind of close to the end, and I know that you and I have talked about a number of issues, but I want to kind of do what we call an audible or switch up.
Mm.
And the question is, I think we can both answer it, but how do you get to the point you get to talk like you talk today? In other words, there are many people who are just as educated as us or who have just as much experience in working in the trenches, but they would never say one half of what you and I say. What gives you the freedom, or let's say, and I don't like using the word kahunas because it's a Spanish word that's beyond my bell curve understanding, but how do you as a person speak truth to power? And we got other people who follow in our footsteps and they don't have that tenacity, or they don't have the wherewithal, or hubris is the word, to speak to that. So are you ever afraid of someone coming at you, even though you're speaking very strongly about truth to power?
No, I certainly don't worry about it now. When I worked at UC San Diego, um, I had to be cognizant of it. I had to be aware of it. And I feel like I pushed the envelope, as they say. I wasn't stupid enough to say something that was so blatant and that it would get me fired because in my
Well,
position,
wait, Patrick, hold it. What could that be? I mean, what? How? Give me example, because I want to avoid that getting fired. But what could get you in trouble if you work in higher education as a
well, I
scholar?
think the obvious thing is that you're not going to just brazenly insult somebody's personal life or something. But
Oh, okay.
I'll give you an example though of things that I said that a lot of people were afraid to say. That I would get up and say, that the institution where I work, UC San Diego, is a racist institution. And if the administrators got upset about that, I'd say, well, look at the scholarly information about how that's defined. Look at how institutional racism is defined. What does the scholarship say about that? I'm a scholar of higher education. Okay, I have a PhD. I've done research in higher education. You have not. I'm talking to the administration and saying, again, look at what the experts say and what you're supposed to be a scholarly institution. Follow the scholarship. And any reasonable scholar of diversity in higher education will conclude that we are a racist institution. So I think, I often tried to mentor students about getting PhDs and arming themselves. It's like our armor, man. This is the closest thing we have to carrying guns when we go to work and protecting ourselves, and so there's a number of strategies I think that we could talk about for days about how you're able to be an advocate. But I think one of the things that I'm very fortunate to say is that when I was a young person and I first started to think about being an activist in my community, I had very powerful mentors. I had people, and I'll say this, maybe it was a coincidence, but I had some very strong role models and mentors that were Mexican women that were involved in the local Chicano community in Omaha. And I watched them, I listened to them, I paid attention to the courage that they demonstrated. And I also had people that I didn't really know well personally, like Senator Ernie Chambers. And I think following the examples, so it's really critical that as we're getting socialized to become activists or change agents, that we have those strong mentors and role models that they'll speak truth to power, as you say, and they'll deal with the consequences. So um, it's very interesting. I lost out on a number of opportunities. So in my professional life because of the things that I said and the advocacy that I did. There's absolutely no doubt. I lost out on jobs. I lost out on promotions. I got written reprimands. They put a ton of stress on me. They threatened to fire me. And when they didn't want to create a martyr by leaning on me personally, they would get at me by reducing the budget of the office that I directed. So they've got their tools too, and that's the sort of thing that you have to be willing to accept that. It's not for everybody, man, but
Right. Well,
those are the decisions you have to make.
one of the reasons I asked you that is because you and I have not really talked about some of the struggles you face in terms of did you ever get reprimanded at your university? This is the first conversation you and I have ever had. I do
Mhm.
like to take a bragging notion. I got put on probation twice at Catholic Charities. Even though I was the longest serving atheist there, they should have treated me with kid gloves. But again, I caught hell for being an African American and African for the community. So my folder is big as Ernie says, was a Creighton as a telephone book of my personnel folders. At Promise Ship, I got put on probation one time because somebody just lied on me and they had to use that because they were trying to put me in my place. But it is something wonderful about fighting in a cage with a lion and you come out alive and you still got some battle marks to show it. I see these half-baked, featherweight, dead weights and lightweights walking around talking about they want to do this and run for office and that. And let me give you a quick example. No disrespect. But anyway, we had an election the other day in Omaha. And so there was somebody I was going to go vote for, even though the person don't have a chance of winning, but it was a person who I knew. So me and my wife are in the car, and I said, oh, honey, I'm going to go vote. You know, I got to vote at the church. I know that's one way they get me to church is they make me go there to vote. So I go in there to vote. And so, you know, being married for 42 years, I said to my wife, honey, come on and go on here with me and vote. She said, why don't I get out of my car and waste some graphite? To my chagrin, I went in there. They're not using pencils anymore. They're using ink pens. So I
Mm.
went to vote, and there was only two people to vote for, the person, city council person, and of course, the mayor. And at the end of the day, when I came back out, she looked at me and said, do you feel better now? So she was saying, I'm not voting for none of these people or whatever. And I just said to myself, you know, you got a point there. But it was almost like a patriotic thing that I had to do. But at the same time, Patrick, is part of our sadness where we look behind us and we think we're going to pass that baton back to someone and they sleeping or they haven't read the book or they haven't done their homework. In the meanwhile, we wonder why we get beat up all the time. You be counting on our community to help us. And again, the constructive and a collective of our community is not going forward because we can't have these conversations. Again, we may disagree on a lot of things, but at the point of contention should be, are we moving forward? And when you look at the prison system that's predominantly in California and different cities and states and so on, predominantly brown and black people, you look at our educational system, we are not in a key position of leadership. Who's going to speak to that? And I expect my religious friends to do that. But again, as you know, it's not easy. So, any closing comments you would like to make before we wind down?
I think just to pick up on what you just said, I think the very first time I voted in the United States was in 1972 when I went in and voted for George McGovern against Richard Nixon. And I don't think, I'm pretty sure I have not missed an election since then. Wherever I've been, I voted. And even in these off years when the president's not running, I never miss a chance to vote. But I don't think I've ever had one experience where I really felt good coming out of that polling place. So I can identify what you're saying. And your wife asked you, "Do you feel better?" Man, I don't think I've ever felt good coming out of the polling place. That's a really sad commentary for a country that says that we're the best democracy in the world. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Patrick Velasquez, it's always a pleasure to bring some heavy light to the conversations. I do know that part of our agenda at more is to have these conversations and get people to move to another level. And hopefully we will provide some enlightenment, as Matthew Stelly used to say, throw down some heavy light and let them get a little retina damage. But really appreciate you doing this. And hopefully we can come back again and continue these conversations. As we
Yep.
always end, we say Baroko, and then Baroko means good night in Setswana. We hope you have a good day.
Okay, you too. Take care.
Take care.